like say something. Not my strong suit. All right, exclamation points for Gemini 4. Heck yeah. Hello, Diane. Good to see your name in print. All right, so the episode is supposed to be about the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, which is where astronauts train for spacewalks. Spacewalks, like, were first performed shortly after the first person was in space, so 1960s. And the question has to be asked, why do you need to go outside of the spaceship? There's nothing there for you to go and, like, you can't walk around. So what are you up to? And there's a couple of answers. There are reasons that you need to go outside. But the main one is the space race was really a moon race. And so if you want to go to the moon, you're probably wanting to go outside and walk around. So you need a spacesuit that can do that. If you want to test a spacesuit for the moon, it's probably a good idea to test that spacesuit around the Earth and just, in space before you go to the moon. So that's a good reason to start testing some EVA, extravehicular activities, as they're sometimes referred to. EVA, spacewalk, same thing. So you want to see what your suit can do first, but then there's other reasons. Perhaps you might need to repair something on your spacecraft. That wasn't really a reason for the early stuff, but when we talk about the International Space Station a little bit later, that's the main reason. Well, not the main reason, but that's one of the reasons you go outside nowadays. But
I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. Unmute yourself if you got something to say.
Okay. 1960s, you had film cameras, and you would put cameras on the spacecraft, and so you would have to go outside to change out these cameras. You could also have experiments mounted on the outside of the spacecraft that you would have to retrieve, and there was just no other way of doing it. So let's actually start getting into it and breaking down the first, I think it's the first 4. Let me check my notes here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10. The first 10 spacewalks in history. To give you guys an idea of why going outside the spacecraft probably isn't a good idea. So, March 18th, 1965. This is a Soviet mission. It's the Voskodh 2. I actually built one in Kerbal, but I didn't transmit the video to this computer, so I'm not going to show you that. I'll have to let me jump on the internet and show you guys what the Jonathan, help me with the Soviet pronunciations of these. Voskodh 2, which we talked in an earlier episode about the Vostok meaning east, the Voskodh means sunrise. So sticking with that kind of naming scheme. 2 spacecraft. A beautiful little spacecraft here. And can I get a big picture? Well, let's just take this one. Save as. So at this point in time, the Soviets are completely dominating. Oh, I'm on that. I don't want to show you guys that. Oh, every time I type it too, man, I still gotta figure out better keys for changing the cameras. All right, I'm almost there, guys. All right. So this is an artist's concept of that first spacewalk. You can pull it up on YouTube if you want, and maybe listen to me or listen to it. Not much to be seen. The cameras are, I think there's a camera here and a camera here. Not the best views in the world. The Soviets just kind of pulled this off last minute. They knew that the Americans were going to be going for a spacewalk with the Gemini program, and so they wanted to beat us to the punch. So they kind of quickly made this inflatable airlock, which is ingenious in its engineering and mechanics, and a simple way to make an airlock. So what is an airlock? So basically, you have the pressurized space capsule, and if you want to leave this capsule, you have to open some sort of door, and that exposes the entire craft to the vacuum of space. So a way to get around this, and people actually use this in their homes now, is an airlock. I need something else with some volume. I have some water from our previous experiment. So you have a door here and a door here. So the astronaut can go out of the main spacecraft into the airlock, close this door, then depressurize the airlock. So now it's vacuum out here, vacuum in here, open up this hatch, and he can go out. And then these astronauts in here are still in a pressurized capsule. It's all fine and dandy, except for I don't know why they felt they needed an airlock. The Americans didn't go with an airlock system. They just depressurized the whole darn capsule and just opened it up and walked out. Seems like a simpler solution. I don't know what the volumes of the two different spacecraft are, but the Voskodh, I'm not doing it, is pretty darn small. Like, they had to squeeze the two astronauts to get in there. So I would think that it's a pretty small volume, and they could have gotten away with just depressurizing the whole thing. But I'm sure they had their reasons. So let's go back to this image here. This flight set a record for speed and altitude at the time. It had an orbit about 300 miles, just pretty tall. So basically, Alexei Leonov, the cosmonaut here, floating in space, got out. He's on a tether that's supplying oxygen. Voskodh, like the fish. Thank you, Jonathan. That'll work. So as soon as he stepped out, essentially, he started to notice that his suit ballooned much more than expected. So if you've ever gone driving and changed elevation drastically, you may hear things in your car moving. So if you have like a bag of potato chips that's sealed, and it was sealed at a certain elevation, and then you change that elevation, the outward air pressure can crinkle on the bag. Same with water bottles, stuff like that. So, and you can notice it on your ears popping. That's the little cavities inside your ear acclimating to the pressure on the outside. So in space, there's no pressure from the outside, so all of the pressure is coming from the inside, so it wants to push the suit out into a balloon shape. It actually ballooned so much that he noticed his hands and feet slipping out of the gloves and boots, which is a bad thing to happen. But he didn't stay out very long. I want to say it was like less than 15 minutes outside of the spacecraft. But then it was time to get back in. And this is when things really started to get hair-raising. You can see this opening here is not very big compared to the size of this astronaut, or cosmonaut. And if he's ballooned up even more, that's really going to be a problem. And it was, in fact. He couldn't get back in. And so without actually communicating with ground control, he purged air out of his spacesuit, reducing that internal pressure so that the suit would come back to its original shape so that he could get back in. The problem with doing a maneuver like that is that's rapid depressurization. That's how you get the bends. So this could have killed him. He also kind of, I wouldn't say in a panic, but in his rush to get back in and inability to get in the way he was supposed to, he actually re-entered the vehicle head first, which he was not supposed to do, but I think he basically had no way. Like, if you look at this, it'd be very hard to hold on to this part of the airlock and then move your body in a way to get your feet into here. I don't think they had really considered how difficult it was going to be. He has no means of moving his body. There's no air resistance to push against or anything. All he can do is grab onto the tether and pull. So basically when he did that, he ended up coming in head first. That made it really difficult to turn around to get back to his chair over here inside the capsule. And by the time he actually got back where he needed to get, he was on the edge of heat exhaustion. So that was a pretty hair-raising first spacewalk for mankind. It almost was not completed at all in several ways. So, because almost died of the bends, or could have, almost couldn't get back to his seat, almost passed out of heat exhaustion. These are all bad things. But that was not the end of Voskodh 2's problems on this mission. So I can't find another picture, but down here underneath there is a retro rocket that burns this to come back to the Earth. They also have a backup one up here, good Soviet design. It was supposed to fly on an automated system, but that failed. So they had to wait another orbit, and then they did a manual reentry burn. And this was actually the first time that had ever been done. But in order to get the manual reentry burn, they had to be in kind of different locations, and then they had to move back to their chairs. And in the seat of the capsule, that's when the capsule is balanced properly. But in this other configuration to get the reentry burn, it's not balanced, and it took them 46 seconds to go from setting up the burn to back in their chairs. And that 46 seconds was enough of the spacecraft to be unbalanced to send them off course after the reentry burn. So that put them nearly 400 kilometers off course. And they landed in the Ural Mountains, and it took them over a day to be located by the Soviet military. And even when they did find them, they were in such dense forest that the helicopter had to land 9 kilometers away, and people had to ski in with supplies for them. And I believe the one astronaut, he said something about how many kilos he lost and how much water there was in his boots. Oh, and another thing, they landed in the mountains of Russia. It was very cold, negative 25 Celsius. That's like really cold. And the heater inside the spacecraft stopped working. So they had a very cold night waiting for rescue, with his feet in completely drenched boots. So Alexei Leonov had a pretty rough go of it. He said it was not enjoyable. I'm sure the spacewalk was scary, but life-changing. The landing and rescue was probably just miserable. So that was the first spacewalk, and it kind of, all of these hiccups kind of was the last nail in the coffin for the Soviet program. It wasn't, but it was the beginning of the end. This is kind of the last thing that the Soviets did in the traditional space race that was showing them to be the dominant, country. They did have other firsts later on, but once we had the moon landing, all of their other firsts just didn't seem scary like Sputnik was. So, for instance, the Soviets actually landed on the moon first. It just wasn't a manned landing. And so things like that. They actually had a rover on the moon decades before anyone else did. So there is something to be said for Soviet robotics from the 60s that is very impressive. The other thing that happened shortly after this flight is Sergei Korolev, who was he was the von Braun of the Soviet space agency. He died about 6 months after this flight, and that was really the final nail in the coffin for the Soviet moonshot. Once he was out or dead, they just didn't have the guidance. They didn't have the man with the vision, and it all kind of started to unravel after that. Let me get caught up on my comments real quick, and I will tell you the second spacewalk. Yeah, this is a birthday card from Janelle's aunt and uncle from last year. I have one for this year, but I haven't opened it yet because it's not my birthday. Yeah, Jonathan commenting on they opened the hatch after landing and heard wolves. The Soviets did have, I believe, at this time, had a gun on board, which has been used as propaganda about how crazy the Soviets were at the time, that they would bring a gun into space. But actually, the gun was for after they landed, if they needed to fend off wild animals. So the gun was not because they were afraid of getting robbed in space or anything like that. It had a pretty useful function. However, Leonov did later tell in an interview that he had a cyanide capsule for his spacewalk if he couldn't get back in. Luckily, he didn't have to use it.
Jonathan, can you hear me?
And Diane noting that none of the other Soviet accomplishments got them closer to the moon, and that's very true.
What's up, Jim?
The way I kind of interpret it is they kind of saw the writing on the wall and very quickly went from, okay, if we're not going to get the moon, what can we do? And then they quickly got into space stations and long-duration space flight and some other stuff like that. We went to Mars, they went to Venus, let them have Mars.
I don't think Jim is ashamed to be associated with Ed White.
And they could, get some other things pulled off.
This is a couple of years before
and Diane also saying they couldn't pull off Rendezvous, which is not the topic of this episode, but is another very important maneuver to pull off a moon landing. We could maybe do an episode just on interesting rendezvous, but we're going to do interesting spacewalks. I'm not getting the musical references. Okay, all right, moving on. So now we come to the Americans' first spacewalk. And let's see if I can pull up the YouTube. And let me know if the audio goes crazy. And hopefully you guys are seeing it. So this is Ed White leaving the Gemini capsule. There goes the thermal glove, lost in space. Not there forever. So this is the first American spacewalk, and you can see there he's got something in his hands. That's known as the Astronaut Maneuvering Unit, or AMU. It's got two thrusters here that point back towards the astronaut, and then there's a forward-facing thruster, and that it's just compressed air, and then there's a camera on top that's kind of allowing him to maneuver around. A very nice thing to have. If Leonov had something like that, he may have been able to get in feet first rather than having to go in head first. I'm going to pause this real quick. You can see the Gemini door here open. This is the nose of the spacecraft. And then the other door where the other pilot is sitting is kind of down over here. You can see a lot of curvature of the Earth. That is not because they're in a very high orbit. They're actually lower than the Soviets were. This is a semi-fisheye lens, so you're getting some distortions there. There is another camera angle that shows the Earth as it actually is, but it's not pointed at the edge. It's pointed down, and so you don't really see any of the curvature. But it is there. But that curvature that you're seeing here is not the real curvature of the Earth. So they also called that maneuvering unit the space gun. It has a very Buck Rogers look to it. So this spacewalk looks like it's going fine and dandy, and for the most part it is. However, he almost stayed out too long. They kind of got distracted by just how wonderful the spectacle was, and if you listen to the audio on your own, there's that other camera where you couldn't see the curve. Well, that was back ways because I'm looking at the comments here. Hold on, let's see, right here. And this is the edge of the window, is also not the curvature of the Earth, but there's the flat field view. So eventually there's a call out. You've got less than 5 minutes. That less than 5 minutes is referring to how much daylight they have, not oxygen or anything like that. But when getting back in the capsule, you kind of want to be able to see what you're doing. This early in the program, they really hadn't thought everything out quite yet, and so there's no real exterior lights. There's no lights on the suit. There's a lot of things missing that will be seen in later iterations of the spacewalk. So they're just kind of talking back and forth and losing track of time, and then all of a sudden the flight director says, "Get back in the capsule now." And the flight director actually doesn't talk directly to the astronauts. There's always a ground control person who is the only person that speaks directly to the astronauts, and it is typically another astronaut. And so he calls out, "The flight director told you to get in the capsule now," which is a pretty funny call. And he goes, "Okay, all right, I'm getting back in." But he had trouble. I forgot to mention on the Soyuz, they had, or Soyuz, the Voskodh, they had trouble with the hatch. And Gemini also had trouble with the hatch. So he had trouble getting back in, and then once they went to close the hatch, it wouldn't seal correctly. And they had to take some things apart, and then it finally latched. All in all, he only spent about 20 minutes outside the capsule, just enough to beat the Soviets and have a longer duration spacewalk. But it definitely put some people at NASA on edge, and we'll see that continue on Gemini 9. So a few missions later, Tom Stafford and Eugene Cernan are piloting Gemini 9. And this is a pretty fun mission. June 5th, 1966. They were also plagued with some problems. The first thing is they were supposed to, this was going to be a rendezvous. So there was going to be an EVA to demonstrate a maneuvering unit. Unlike the little gun, it was going to be a full flight pack so that you wouldn't have to have an umbilical cord. And then they were going to test rendezvous and docking. However, their Agena target blew up at launch. It was unmanned, but they didn't have anything. So they pushed the mission back, and they launched a backup called the Augmented Target Docking Adapter. And that is a smaller target vehicle, same docking port, and the size is really unimportant, but it had less capabilities on its own. But here it is, and this has been referred to as the Angry Alligator. You can see the nose cone there. That was supposed to deploy and open up much wider, and there was a band that didn't release, and it got stuck in that position. And so when they got rendezvous, Stafford called down to the ground that it looked like there was an angry alligator waiting for him, and it didn't look too good, because this is what they're supposed to be docking to, and all of this is now in the way. So, what are you going to do? Well, Stafford wanted to bump it with the Gemini spacecraft to see if that would dislodge it. And Cernan wanted to go out there and manually try to pry the jaws of the alligator apart on a spacewalk. And fortunately for them, NASA decided that both of those options were too dangerous or stupid to try to do. And so the docking was scrubbed from the mission, and they're going to have to just try to do the EVA. So Cernan goes for the EVA, and within minutes from overexertion, his helmet fogged up, and he couldn't really see too well. And what he was supposed to be doing, all right, back to me, while I go back to the internet. If anyone wants to buy me a really expensive Gemini model, feel free, because I would love one. Gemini Spacecraft. All right, so here's the Gemini spacecraft on Google. He's supposed to go out of the capsule, walk to the back here, and then pull out from one of the service bays this jetpack. And he was really struggling. He couldn't really get it done. Every time he tried to turn something, he would turn instead of it. His visor fogged up. He's overexerting himself. And so when his heart rate got to like 180 beats per minute, Stafford, well, I shouldn't get into the minds of these people too much. The takeaway is Stafford called it off before the night came because he didn't want him to be struggling in the dark, and so he called off the spacewalk early. It still ended up being an over 2-hour spacewalk, so pretty good, but he also had difficulty re-entering the capsule and closing the door. And so this is really starting to become a problem. But I don't believe they figured out a solution until after Gemini 10. So let's fast forward to Gemini 10. John Young and Michael Collins, names you may be familiar with. John Young, I said, was one of my favorites from the last episode. And Michael Collins was your command module pilot on Apollo 11. So 2 heavyweights there. They had 2 planned EVAs for this mission. The first one was a stand-up EVA, and what that means is you're not actually going outside of the capsule. You're just kind of standing up in your seat and turning around and grabbing some stuff on the back side of the capsule, or just snapping some pictures. And so that one went pretty well. However, both astronauts suffered eye irritation from a defogging agent, and he had trouble holding onto the camera because of the pressure exerted in the gloves. The gloves want to be like this, and so if you're trying to hold something, you're holding it against that outward pressure. And so holding something for 30 minutes can become very tiresome. There were actually reports on various EVAs, the really long ones that come later, of astronauts losing fingernails and stuff because of just how much they had to clamp over and over again. If your hand is a little too big for the suit and it rubs on the inside every time you're gripping, not pleasant. So the second EVA, they also rendezvoused with an Agena target. And so he collected a micrometeorite experiment collection unit off of the Gemini capsule. Then he floated over to the Agena and got one of those as well. But he came back completely exhausted. and this is Michael Collins, who's doing the EVA. So I watched an interview with Gene Kranz, and he said, we had 3 spacewalks or 4 spacewalks, and all of them pretty much went horribly. What are we doing? Maybe we've got this all wrong. And the fact of the matter is that they did. Most of their EVA training up to that point was done in the Vomit Comet that I mentioned earlier, the plane that goes up and down, up and down. On the down, you get a zero gravity environment. So they thought that would be perfect. It's zero gravity. That'll train them. However, the short durations that those things are made it difficult to do a lot of things, and it turned out to not be working too well. They also didn't give the astronauts much in the way of handholds and footholds on the spacecraft, so once they got outside, they're basically just floating around with nothing to hold on to. So Buzz Aldrin gets involved and starts the water training. And I believe I have a picture. I couldn't find many from way back in the day. But this is a Gemini astronaut. I don't know exactly who it is, but this is a mock-up of an Agena target vehicle. This is a mock-up of the Gemini spacecraft, and this is an astronaut training to do some work in a underwater scenario. And this changed the game. Buzz Aldrin had been a diver for most of his young life, and so he was very comfortable with the dive aspect of it. And so that's how he trained. And when it was time for his spacewalk, if you like Buzz Aldrin and you want to see a very smug Buzz Aldrin, listen to his interviews talking about the first, or his first, well, not his first, but his spacewalks on Gemini 12. He is so proud that his spacewalks went off flawlessly and he didn't have any problems. And he's like, what are these guys doing? I mean, it is hilarious. So I highly recommend checking out Buzz Aldrin's interview about Gemini 12. I skipped Gemini 11, though. So Pete Conrad and Richard Gordon doing the EVAs here. He had Gemini 11 is probably the weirdest thing that's ever been done in Earth orbit. So they have the Agena target vehicle, played by this remote, and they had... I don't have a good Gemini spacecraft. Again, if anyone wants to send me a model. This Eraser is our Gemini spacecraft. So instead of rendezvousing, what they did is he gets out of the spacecraft and attaches a tether to the Agena spacecraft, and then they're going to try to rotate these things up in orbit to try to create artificial gravity. This turned out to be a horrible idea. When they got slack and all of, if you've ever towed a vehicle, it can be rather jarring. And in space, it's like, that's not where you want jarring things to be happening. And so they've got these 2 spacecraft tethered together. And it's like, if you bounce them, now they're going to want to come and crash into one another. It was such a wild idea, and really probably wasn't as thought out as it should be, because they quickly figured out that this is probably not safe to be doing. But anyway, while that was going on, his visor also fogged up, and Pete Conrad called it off about 33 minutes into that spacewalk. And then his second EVA was a stand-up, so nothing as rigorous as the full umbilical EVAs, just standing up. And they said that EVA was so relaxing that there was times where they both fell asleep with the doors open, which is also pretty funny. So now we are at Gemini 12 with my boy Jim Lovell, who we talked about in Apollo 13. and Buzz Aldrin, who is famously the second man on the moon. So his first EVA was a stand-up, just to take pictures and collect external experiments. Nothing, to write home about that one. This is all basic routine stuff at this point. That was a 2.5-hour EVA. EVA number 2. This was the first completely successful EVA in spaceflight history. He successfully deployed and recovered experiments, installed and removed cameras, and practiced work techniques using a ratcheting wrench. That was a just over 2-hour EVA. He had the benefit of knowing what all the other astronauts have been through. He had the benefit of the water tank training, and he also had the benefit of a space capsule that had foot locks and handholds on it. So that really made everything a lot easier. But that water training, EVAs are often called ballets. Every motion has to be mapped out as to what it's going to do to your body. And Buzz Aldrin just said that he was really good at understanding what his body needed to do and how to keep it from going where he didn't want it to go. Okay. And then he had one more stand-up EVA after that. Gemini 12 was a long-duration mission. This was the proof that you could have two humans in space for the duration of an Apollo mission. So they spent over 2 weeks in that Gemini capsule. It's a quite long bit of time. Lovell later told someone that he had basically spent enough time with Buzz Aldrin and that they had each had their fill of one another after that. They never flew together again. Keep in mind that the Gemini spacecraft is about the size of a standard cab truck where you don't really go anywhere and you're in your seats for 2 weeks. So think of all the other things that you have to do as a human being, sitting right next to someone for 2 weeks. So that actually ended the Gemini program, and there wouldn't be another EVA until Apollo 9. But, I mean, it took us nearly 5 flights to figure out how to get this done more effectively. And that is where we come to the Neutral Buoyancy training facility. Here's another photo. It'll open. I think I just opened 2 of them. So here's another photo of a neutral buoyancy tank. I don't know what this is. This might not actually be NASA, but might be something else. I just pulled this from the internet. This one definitely is, though. This is the Apollo boys doing their water training, or not taking it serious. This is actually not training for EVAs, but training leaving the capsule once it's in the water. But it's just so funny to see them all on their little inflatables in full spacesuits. And this looks like the Apollo 1 crew, because that is Gus Grissom right there. Which means, is that Ed White? Roger Chaffee? I think so. Looks fun. All right, let me get caught up on my comments, and we will start talking about the Neutral Buoyancy Lab. There's a good video of Buzz Aldrin punching a flat earther. I have seen that more times than I care to admit. Yeah, it's a good one. And I often tell flat earthers, if you think the earth is flat, you go up to Buzz Aldrin and tell him that you think the earth is flat. Because it's one thing to just it's not just flat earthers. It's, was it a flat earther? I think it was a moon hoaxer. Moon hoaxers. If you think that those guys didn't go to the moon, then you go and tell them that you think they didn't go to the moon and see what they have to say about it, because they definitely did. And then my mom saying 2 weeks in a spacecraft is about as bad as 2 months by yourself in this isolation. You know, they were just social distancing before it was cool. All right, let's get rid of this picture and let's start talking about the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, or the NBL. What picture do I want to start with? So, let's see here. Am I going the wrong way? Oh, that's the one I wanted. Oh, here's a quick shot of that maneuvering unit. So 2 little compressed air tanks, a thing over here that looks like it's adjustable. So there's a nozzle here, and then 2 nozzles there, and then a camera that he could hold to kind of help him maneuver around. Very Buck Rogers. That's a piece of space memorabilia for a collection. All right, and I'm just struggling to find the picture I want to start us off. There it is. Okay, so this is the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, and you can see quite a lot in this photo here. We have several cranes for lowering things. There's actually a couple of suits here on pedestals that they lower it into, and then you can see a bunch of stuff under the water, and these are all mock-ups of different parts of the International Space Station. So the lab itself, I'm on the other side now. The pool measures 202 feet by 102 feet by 40.5 feet deep. You do the math, that turns out to have a volume of about 834,000 gallons of water. Roughly 10 Olympic swimming pools in volume, so rather large. And what is under there is all of this kind of stuff. So you can see just how massive this pool is with all these divers down here. And these are 1-to-1 scale replicas of the International Space Station hardware. So almost every module is up there in some form. And we can scroll through some other pictures here, some other modules. So now everything that needs to be done, some other pictures, you can see here an astronaut going up a handrail here with some other divers that are, just safety divers, making sure everything's good. Another astronaut in the background there. And so if you're going to install something on the International Space Station, you are going to do it in the pool several times before your flight. I've heard quoted that most astronauts spend 400 hours in the pool before they perform a spacewalk. Not for any particular walk. Some of them you're rehearsing for a particular task very well, but then other times something happens on the station and very quickly they need to put together some sort of routine to go fix something. And so they're also just practicing general procedures that need to be done. They also work on a tether system. So when you're on the space station, you can see here he's got 2 tethers, and basically you're always anchored at one location, and usually 2. Usually you're only anchored in one when you're anchoring to another. So you unclip one. Where's my clip? This is not what NASA tethers look like. They have a retractable unit, but it's very similar to a carabiner. So you're going to have 2 of these. You're going to be locked in somewhere, but now you need to get over there. So you can see there's different segments of the rail system, and so you would be clipped into this one over here. You take this one off, you clip it over there. Once that one's clipped, you can unclip this one, clip it over here, and now you can move down the spacecraft. And always be tethered to the station. This is something every movie gets wrong for some reason. In every space movie I see, no matter how good it is, except for Apollo 13, I think 2001 got really close to doing it correctly, but there is that part where he gets booted off by that dish antenna, and he should have been tethered down. I don't know what was going on. Hello, some new people coming in. Yeah, every space movie, it's like they just don't have a tether when they're supposed to, or then they tether themselves down when they don't need to. It's very strange. There was one instance where they didn't use tethers. It's a famous photo of the sole astronaut with the jetpack. Let's see if I can find that. It's a famous photo. I'm sure I can just find it. Well, that's kind of it. Let's see. My computer is slow. Oh, that's not a very good picture. Let's see if I can zoom in here. Not the greatest picture, but a great picture. This guy is untethered, but he is sitting basically in a chair that is a full-blown spaceship. There's a better photo where he's like way out in the distance, and you can see just how far away from the space shuttle he got. But man, that's got to be scary, because if anything goes wrong with that thing, you know, you're untethered. How are you gonna get back? These are all good questions. Oh, I do have some other hair-raising things that happened during some spacewalks. And then finally, I'm going to wrap up talking about spacesuits, and we're already in an hour, so that'll be fine. So Chris Hadfield, every Canadian's favorite astronaut, and a pretty good astronaut. He's a cool dude. His first spacewalk in April of 2001, he was working on building the ISS. The anti-fog coating that they use, they actually didn't use on these earlier missions, which is why all of them fogged up. They started using anti-fog, and there's a procedure for putting the anti-fog in, and Chris Hadfield didn't get all of it out. And so what happened, this anti-fog is basically a detergent. He's in his suit. A little piece of detergent is floating around. It gets into his eye, and his eye starts to tear up. On Earth, when you tear up, your tears roll down your cheeks like a romantic comedy. In space, they don't go anywhere. They hover in your eye. And this helped spread the detergent in the water more, made his eyes water more, and he got a big blob of water over his eye. It then crossed the bridge of his nose and got into his other eye. So now both of his eyes are completely covered in water, making it virtually impossible to see. He had to try to like move his head in a way that would dislodge this water. Fortunately for him, he was able to get it back or get back into the station without too many problems. And I don't remember the specifics of whether he got everything he needed to get done on that spacewalk. I'd have to go back to his book and read it again, which I'm not going to do. Another thing that happened to Chris Hadfield on a spacewalk is he was fixing a ammonium cooling system on the space station, and he got ammonium on his suit, and it's pretty caustic stuff. They didn't want to bring it back into the station, so he got to sit out in the sun until it cooked this stuff off of his suit, and he said he got to spend like 45 minutes or an hour or something just watching the world go by. Had no other things that he had to do. He got kind of taken out of the loop for that time and just had to sit there and wait. That's a pretty cool bad thing to happen to you. He said he really enjoyed that time looking down on the Earth. And then probably the most famous EVA of our generation happened in 2013. Luca Parmentano, I don't know. I think he's is he Italian? I don't think he was an American astronaut, but he was on the ISS using their suits, and we'll go over the suits in a little bit. And what started to happen is water started infiltrating his helmet. This is unlike the Chris Hadfield experience. This is not his fluids, and it also was quickly realized that it was not fluid from the drink bag that they have. This was lots of fluid coming from somewhere else, and it turned out there was a clogged filter that basically made this happen. It was getting so bad that on every breath he wasn't sure if he was going to take in air or water. It doesn't take much water in a spacesuit to kill you. If you basically just have a blob of water, the size of what's a good fruit to use? An orange. If it's over your mouth and nose, and you can't find a way to dislodge it by moving your head because it's just going to slosh back around into your mouth, you're basically toast. So you can literally drown in ounces of water in a spacesuit. So he very quickly was able to get back inside, get the helmet off, and was okay. They figured out the filtering problem, fixed it on the rest of the suits, and haven't had anything like that since. There are some other stories, but I'm not familiar with them. Basically, you talk to every astronaut, and they'll probably tell you something you've never heard before, especially if they've done EVAs. They are the most dangerous thing you can do in manned spaceflight, because as we're going to see, what a spacesuit really is a personal spaceship. Let me get caught up on my comments. Man Maneuvering Unit, yeah, MMU. Are the dead bodies of the crashes floating around in space? What crashes are we referring to? There are no dead bodies floating around in space. Even if there were dead bodies in space, they would deorbit relatively quickly. Like they wouldn't be floating up there for a decade unless they're way out there, orbiting the moon or something. All right, spacesuits. I want to talk about two different spacesuits. Every spacesuit is an evolution on the last one, but you need all of the systems of a normal spaceship. So you need oxygen, you need temperature control, you need power, you need protection from the elements. So how do you do that? Well, let's look at some photos here. So this is what... Man, my computer's slow. So this is what most people think of when they think of spacesuit. This is the lunar EVA suits. They are highly specialized for the lunar surface. Most notably, probably the boots. So on a typical EVA, if you look at the footage from the Gemini 4, you can see the bottom of the boots there, and they just look like almost like just regular boots. And on the modern ISS boots, you can look at those. They don't really look like anything. That's because you're not really walking anywhere. But on the moon, you most definitely are. So there's a real boot. And in fact, there's two boots there. There's an overboot in the final layer of the suit, and then there's an underboot that's part of the pressure suit. So what I actually want to show you guys are the different layers, which I don't have a photo of for the Apollo suit. So actually what I want to bring up is this. That is what's underneath all of that white exterior that we just saw. That is the real spacesuit. If you ask someone like, what is a spacesuit? It's the thing that keeps air pressure in this bubble that you can exist in. That is the pressure suit for the Apollo missions. Pretty weird looking, right? It doesn't invoke much confidence, if you ask me. It looks pretty darn scary. You can see these big pleated rubber pieces that allowed for limited mobility in the shoulders, elbow, wrist, and knees. And that's about it. You can also see there's actually two helmets. So this is the actual pressure vessel helmet, and then I can't go back to that other one. Where is it? Here's both of them next. No, that doesn't have it. Here, this is actually the helmet visor system. That's a secondary helmet that goes over everything else. So the Apollo spacesuit was basically three main components. You have a water-cooled nylon undergarment, photo not seen, but basically this is just a garment that has a bunch of tubing that pipes water through it. It's not a heating or cooling system. It's basically a system that just runs water of body temperature constantly. So if you're in a cold environment, it warms you. If you're in a warm environment, it cools you. Then we have the multi-layer pressure suit. That's that blue suit in that photo. And that's actually a three-layer system in itself. It has a nylon layer, then a neoprene-coated nylon layer. That's actually the part that holds against pressure. And then they have a nylon overcoat that restrains the pressure layer. Basically, that layer wants to balloon out, and there's a layer that's trying to hold it from ballooning any further. Then after that, you have a 5-layer aluminized mylar and 4 layers of dichron. That is a heating layer that's supposed to insulate you from the harsh temperature regimes that we're talking about. There's then a 2-layer kapton. This is further heat protection. And then we have a Teflon coated cloth, which is for abrasion resistance. And then finally the white Teflon top coat that you see here, which is also for abrasion, micrometeorite impacts, scuffing yourself up against lunar rocks. The people that built these suits, I believe it was Playtex. They were making bras before they made spacesuits, but they were the people that really understood the fabrics and how to get what NASA wanted out of them. Every single piece of the spacesuit was hand stitched, and then every single stitch had to be checked multiple times for integrity. And I remember watching a documentary, and it was the people that made the spacesuits watching the moon landing. And they said that from their perspective, every time they showed an astronaut, they were falling down. And every time they fell down, they're like holding their breath because they know more than anyone that if that suit fails, that the world is going to watch an astronaut die in mere minutes. So they were on edge and really wanted the astronauts to be more careful than they were. You can watch plenty of videos of the astronauts. I wouldn't say reckless, but it's probably hard to resist when you're in 1/6 gravity. Diane will have to tell me what mission it was, but the 2 astronauts decided to have a moon Olympics, and the first astronaut jumped as high as he could. He's wearing a several 100-pound spacesuit, but he only weighs 1/6 what he normally weighs. So he got pretty high, probably about like 4 feet off the ground, which doesn't sound like a lot, but trust me, that's pretty high. And then because of how he jumped, his weight distribution was off a little bit. And so he jumped up, and then the weight, he's more back heavy, and so he kind of like landed in a very weird angle and bounced out of it. I can't imagine what the people that made the suits were thinking. And just a bunch of other things. I mean, just Google astronauts or Apollo astronauts falling over. It's hilarious, especially when they start to fall and then they think that they can correct themselves and they just go skipping across the surface. Diane saying Charlie Duke fell a lot. Yeah. It's I mean, there's no way around it. The other part of it is that if we go back to do that first photo that I had, this one, you can see here there's this backpack that he's got on, and it goes clear over his head, and it goes down to about this level here. So he's got a very heavy backpack that's very high up on his back. I don't know if you could see me. I was on the wrong camera. So backpack's like starting down here and going all the way up to here, and it's heavy. And so this throws your center of mass from somewhere in here to somewhere, in the height of your back. And so they were very top heavy, and it showed. Charlie Duke said he nearly killed himself. Yeah, I believe it. I'm sure a lot of those guys came back and like after a week realized just how dangerous what they just accomplished really was. I was for my Apollo presentation. I watched a couple interviews with Lovell, and he said it wasn't until about a week or so, like when he was actually home and knew he was safe, that he started to get bummed about losing the moon and the opportunity to walk on the moon. Too distracted with the other things going on until then. All right, so last but not least is the modern spacesuit. This is the EMU extravehicular mobility unit. I don't know. This is what's used by the International Space Station, and it has even more components than the Apollo suit. So it consists of a maximum absorption garment, a liquid cooling and ventilation garment, the electronics harness, the communication carry assembly, the lower torso assembly, the legs, the hard upper torso, which consists of arms, gloves, helmets, and the extravehicular visor assembly, as well as the in-drink bag. This is something that they can hydrate themselves with. These are designed for much longer duration spacewalks. It is not uncommon for astronauts to be in these things for 8 to 10 hours. So having a drink every now and again is a nice thing. Then the primary life support subsystem, secondary oxygen pack, and the display and control module. So a lot going on in these modern suits. And I'll see, these are the ones that you could see in the neutral buoyancy photos, because these are all of the modern or more modern era. So there is a EMU style suit. There's a picture in here that always makes me laugh. This one right here. What? Go back. Just because there's a nice little optical illusion happening where his head looks really small. That's just because of this curved glass here, or not glass per se, but I don't know. Just makes me chuckle. Looks like Bill Gates in a spacesuit. All right. That takes us through spacesuits. What was his? The one of our Gemini astronauts. He had said. Let's see. Let me go through my notes here. I want to say it was Cernan. When they landed, they said that they got like 2 pounds of water out of each boot, and he had lost 10 pounds in that 2-hour spacewalk. To give you an idea of just how overexerted he was. The other thing is those Apollo suits have no systems for waste management. That first layer on both suits, maximum absorption garment. If you read into that a little bit, that basically just means that you pee in the suit and it just kind of sits there until you're done. Sure, that's gotten better in time. It was probably not great in the Apollo era. And in fact, on the early Apollo missions, Apollo 11, they were in their suits the entire flight. They would take their helmets and gloves off, but they were in that pressure suit. Not pressurized all the time, but they were in that pressure suit for the 7 days that mission took. You can also see on the modern suit, these are lights that are adjustable. That also helps because they do 8-hour space flights. That means that they are going into the nighttime and daytime cycle in orbit multiple times during that spacewalk. Basically, you get 45 minutes of day, 45 minutes of night. And so you're going to have to work through it. And so having lights on board is definitely something that helps. There is also some great videos of them losing stuff in space that are pretty funny. My favorite one, an astronaut just lost track of a bag of tools, and there's a video of it just slowly floating out into space. And it's like once it's out of your arm's reach, it's basically gone forever. And it's like the tools in there was like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of very expensive tools. For example, you want a drill motor so that you can drill screws out instead of having to use a hand drill. Well, things don't work the same in zero gravity or in the vacuum of space as they do here on the ground. So you can't use a normal electric motor. Metals that don't have special coatings or oils will fuse together. So if you use any kind of like if you use a drill motor that's less than 10 years old, you can thank NASA for helping develop the electric motors that they're using. All this fancy new brushless stuff was originally developed for use on the International Space Station because you just can't use normal stuff. So they developed really cool, high efficiency, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. Again, with the batteries as well. Batteries are heavy. You want to get the most out of them. So who's going to want to develop the best batteries in the world? NASA. And so all of that stuff eventually comes to the ground and we take advantage of it. I should probably do an episode on space spin-offs. It's I wouldn't say a passion of mine, but when people tell me that they think that NASA's a waste of money, I just immediately go to NASA spin-offs and say, well, how do you like living without this and that and this and that? And the list just goes on forever. But you guys are space fans, so I don't have to lecture you about that. Do they still use Tang? If they want it, they can probably still get it. The menus for astronauts in space has gotten a lot better in the last 20 years. The Apollo guys had a couple of options of a bunch of like dehydrated things. But the ISS people these days have not only a lot more options, but they have different types of things. They also actually do get fresh produce and other perishable items at the beginning of resupplies. So every once in a while, there's a resupply mission to the ISS, and they'll put in some special stuff. Every astronaut gets their own. I have 30 people watching. Is that on YouTube, Jonathan? Well, thank you. out there in the YouTube space. Food. So every astronaut gets to like ask for some special things, and then they also just send up some perishable stuff to be used basically that week as a special treat. Things that the other astronauts did not get. Again, this is kind of there's a lot of romance in the early space program, but you really wouldn't want to do it. Get over here. Aha! Got him. Thought you could get away, did you? Thought you could pull the cover off of my piano and I wouldn't notice? I actually saw a thing about the first kitty in space, but I didn't read that article. So mad. So there's a lot of romance in the early program. Okay. But boy, it really wasn't fun. Again, if I can find my book. What do I got here? Okay. All right, book club time. Really good. But this book talks a lot about the day-to-day stuff that has to go on. And there's like a whole chapter in like shaving and defecating in the early program. And I won't go into it, but man, is it a read. I highly recommend it. It's hard for all of the romance to not leave the room when you hear about taping poop bags to your butt. But I don't know. I'd still do it if I had the chance. I've done worse. All right. Diane filling us in on the first and last Space Kitty. Survived, question mark? Because a lot of people familiar with Laika the dog, that was the first animal in space sent up by the Soviets with no intentions of bringing it back to the Earth. They didn't even like give it thermal protection, and it basically just died of heat exhaustion a few hours into the flight, which was like by design. Yikes. All right. Thank you to Marlene, and a final happy birthday for the episode topic. Shoot me a message if you actually do want your solar system trading cards. I know you got some... Oh, God. Sorry, things are happening in the studio. You behave yourself, young man.
What are you doing, buddy? What are you doing?
Oh, it's getting dark. Yeah. That sounds about right. I have a whole... I once wrote a paper on the utility of animal testing. So if you're interested in that, I'll share it with you. But sometimes you got to do some pretty horrible things. That's all I'm going to say about that. Fortunately, it's all out of the way. We don't have to send any more animals up into space and dissect them, so that ugly period of time is behind us. I'm going to urge everyone to hop over to the W.A.S, Warren Astronomical Society, live virtual open house. Our member Doug Bach and Jonathan helped me out on the details, but he's doing basically remote imaging with his telescope, and you can see what he's doing. And then we're all just talking and having a good time. Thank you, Rachel, for the happy birthday. Jonathan Cade, can you post a link to that stuff on the Facebook? Because we have it in a couple locations. You can either go to YouTube, you can join us on Discord, or they might be on WebEx now. So I will try to get the details of that, and I will either link them in the description or hopefully we'll link it in the comments. Okay, Jonathan's saying right now we're watching me. It's cloudy everywhere. Oh boy, it's just me. Well, let me quickly look at this book. If you guys have any questions about non-EVA or spacesuits, you can also ask me, and we can talk about that. Let's see here. I'm pretty sure the alligator's also in here. EVA. Look at that. That's rendezvous right there. What a beautiful spacecraft. There's Buzz Aldrin on his spacewalk. Just being super sweet and not having any problems at all. Here's some splashdown with some caustic chemicals leaking in. Those suicide doors on the Gemini capsule, man. It doesn't get any better than that. And now we're into Apollo. Some cool photos in here. If you want a awesome picture book of not only Apollo, but some of the earlier missions, Moonshots is a pretty awesome book. This is in my outreach collection, so I have a couple of books that I bring to events specifically just to share pictures of things. Pictures, you know, they're worth 1,000 words, so it's very efficient to just bring something like this. And if I'm talking about, you know, what something looks like, this is what it looks like. Another one that I have is The Cosmos, which is like a huge book over there. And it goes through the planets, it goes through nebulae, it goes through galaxies, it goes through everything. And so you can just talk about all different types of objects and show people examples in that book. So it's cloudy, so there's nothing to look at, so we don't need to talk about the night sky. See if I have a toy to show you guys. All right, Diane's jumping off. Jonathan, if you just WebEx right now. Okay, he'll drop the YouTube after I'm done, and you guys can hop over to that. I highly recommend it. There's always something to learn from that group of people. They are some of my favorite people on this planet. And so whenever we're allowed to physically touch one another again, it will be great to see those people. I miss you all very much. I'm also secretly very glad that Diane is the president right now and not me. I got out just in time. All right. So I don't know what the next video is. Send me some suggestions. If you noticed, this episode was actually not about astronomy. Did you notice that? But it's about space flight, and so most people give that a pass and allow it to be a cool thing to talk about.
You did a math episode. This is definitely acceptable.
No, I know. What I'm saying is I want to do another math video. So if you're okay with the space flight, maybe you'll be okay with some physics-y things. Because the next video I want to share some programs that I've written. It'll be a shorter episode, so.
You say